As we move into this last section of the course, I want to talk about a very interesting 20th century movement called Postmodernism. And the post just means after modernism, just as, post-impressionist came after the impressionist. But what postmodernism did was pretty significant to the development of thought in the 20th century. Postmodernism really subverts the foundations of our ways of knowing and thinking in order to show the meaninglessness of the world. Basically, there was a sense of a disregard for unity. Unity in the sense that a little different from the modern idea, whereas modernism sort of tore up unity. There was no universal truth, there was no absolute. What postmodernism does is sort of revel in the fragments of the ripped up unity. They are not postmodern thought is not concerned with any underlying meanings. There's a sense of pastiche. If you remember back to Yeats, he talked about in his poem that the center does not hold. Well, at least Yeats believed in a center, universal truth or values or culture that was falling apart. Well, by the time we get to the postmodern period, there is no center at all. It is pastiche, if you think about that as an art term. Just images all pasted on top of one another with no true center. So there is no inherent fundamental truth at all. The modernists believed that there was, and it was just fading away. The postmodernists believed that there was no inherent fundamental truth, no center. In other words, no overarching narratives by which we govern or structure our lives. No, there's no universal values that we should adhere to. There's nothing to tell us how to govern ourselves. And so you get, obviously, a great subversion of traditionalism and a great subversion of convention. Some big words of postmodernism are fragmentation, and we've talked a little bit about that. There is no center. Indeterminacy, in the sense that nothing can truly be determined. There is no universal truth. There is no answer. And clearly, the postmodernist mindset is skeptical, constantly questioning, not taking anything at face value, not believing in any fundamental truth or ideals by which to govern life. Therefore, relativism is a very important concept of postmodernism. If there is no truth, then everyone is entitled to his or her own truth, and everyone can make the truth that he or she wants to govern his or her life by. And so this relativism leads to the idea of pluralism, diversity of influences, diversity of ideas. There is no one way. And as we have looked through this course, in Western thought, there had always been a center, and that had always been, some sort of religious concept that had been the center. Christianity, to a large degree, in the Western world. But for postmodernism, that was totally exploded. There was no truth. There was no one right way of looking at things. So this is sort of the 20th century mindset, and I'm sure that you see some of these ideas present in our world today, and maybe in your own thoughts and in the way you view the world. But nevertheless, this came out of the 20th century and this postmodern sensibility. Existentialism is a philosophy that is directly connected to this idea of postmodernism. And the question that existentialists asked, so if we have a universe that is void of inherent truth, that's void of value, and that's void of meaning, which the postmodernists believed, well then how does a person respond to such a world? How does a person respond to such a universe? What is a person to do? And probably the most famous existential philosopher is a Frenchman named Jean-Paul Sartre. And Sartre laid down and defined or sort of set out to answer this question. So if we don't have universal truth, value, or meaning, how does a person respond? What does a person do? And this was sort of Sartre's concept here. So clearly existentialism, along with postmodernism, challenges assumptions of the way people live and have lived. There's no truth, no values, so what do we do? So what Sartre does then in trying to answer that question, he says that people have freedom, absolute freedom, and they should act accordingly in every single situation. So he rejects the idea that existence is based on any objective facts or any objective absolutes. And so people should take action. In other words, people are in charge of their own lives. Okay? Does that make sense? There's no universal truth. There's no universal values. So it's up to people. They have the freedom, therefore, to define life the way they want to. And they need to act accordingly. They decide how they act. No set of rules or regulations decides how they act, but people have perfect freedom to make those decisions. He rejects all traditional values, obviously. You don't have to have order. You don't have to get married. You don't have to have children. All of those sort of central concepts, he said, no, you have freedom from that. That doesn't make you who you are. Rather, he says, a person's existence is what he or she chooses to make it. So that this idea of freedom is Sartre's answer to the question, how does a person respond to a universe that is void of inherent truth, value, or meaning? Well, the answer is that it's the person's responsibility to choose what to do in life. And this idea of freedom can be frightening because it lays all responsibility on an individual. There are no excuses anymore. There is no one to blame but oneself if one's life isn't ideal. So he puts a lot of focus on an individual person defining his or her own existence. He says no one can do that for you. There's no universal value. There's no universal truth. Therefore, you have the absolute freedom to define your life any way that you want to define it. Okay, so this raises some questions. If life is void of meaning, if life is void of absolutes, right, and you have the perfect freedom to govern and set your life up as you want to, as Sartre said you did, then if things go bad, there's no one to blame but yourself. And so that's sort of the rub with existentialism. And that's what this idea of existentialism came out of this postmodern concept. And you also had during this period of time a school of drama called the theater of the absurd. And what the theater of the absurd does is it takes postmodernism and existentialism to its logical conclusion. Okay? If there is no faith, if there is no meaning, if there is no meta-narrative, then truly life is absurd. And so you get many playwrights writing in this school. And one of the most famous absurdist playwright is a man named Samuel Beckett. And he wrote a play in 1952 called Waiting for Godot. And in this play, the two characters, Vladimir and Estragon, are waiting for this character, this person, Godot, who never comes. So they wait and they wait and they wait, and Godot never comes. And Godot is supposed to be able to answer some question or fulfill something in their lives. Some critics claim that Godot is God, and that the play illustrates the absurdity of a world without God and thus meaning. So the playwrights in the theater of the absurd basically said, okay, if we take existentialism and we embrace postmodernism, then we're going to end up not with a free existence, as Sartre would say, but as an absurd existence. So I hope that you can see postmodernism is a very complex topic, and you could take an entire course on postmodernism. But what I want you to make sure you understand is, whereas the modernist period believed that the center, so to speak, truth, values, was falling apart, wasn't holding, was on shaky ground, by the time we get to the middle 20th century and postmodernism, these people believed that it was completely gone. And then what's the reaction to that? You have this philosophy of existentialism, you have this theater of the absurd movement, and as we're going to look on in further down the course, what did that do to art? And so hopefully you can see some of these themes running throughout. Now, after we finish this, there's a video for you to watch that goes into a great deal more detail about Sartre and about existentialism, and hopefully it'll help you get a little bit more secure in some of these concepts and terms.